Hello again, and welcome back to ancient and medieval world history. And we're solidly in medieval world history now. And what we're going to look at in chapter 10 here is the period between about 750 to 800 CE and about 1000. And let's begin once again in the Muslim world. By the year 750, the Arab rulers of the Umayyad Caliphate had spread their empire and had spread Islam well beyond the Arabian Peninsula, to Iberia and North Africa in the west, and to the edge of the Byzantine Empire in the north, and actually as far as the Indus River Valley in the east. And you'll recall from the last chapter that the Umayyads ruled from Damascus, which is in what's now Syria, and they spread Arab culture and the Arabic language. And an example of this culture and of Umayyad architecture is the famous Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, also known as the Dome of the Rock, which is the world's oldest surviving work of purely Islamic architecture and is actually probably the oldest mosque remaining in the world after the Al-Haram Mosque in Mecca. But the Umayyads also had their opponents within Islam, if you'll recall, and many Muslims resented their rule. Non-Arab Muslims were taxed at a higher rate and were barred from holding office. The caliphate, many believed, was treated as an inherited kingship rather than as an elected office. And the lavish court in Damascus clashed with the ascetic ideals of many early Muslims. The Umayyads were ultimately overthrown in a very carefully orchestrated coup that drew on all of this resentment, as well as that of the Shiites, who had been angered by their violent suppression in revolts like the one in Karbala in 680, which I also mentioned previously. After rallying the multi-ethnic adversaries of the Umayyads, a charismatic Persian general named Abu Muslim defeated their armies in a series of battles from 747 to 750. And then nearly the entire Umayyad family was then massacred at what was called the Banquet of Blood in Palestine, except for one prince who escaped to Cordoba. So the Cordoba Emirate in what's now Spain remained an Umayyad emirate. But in the main part of the Muslim world, Abu al-Abbas was proclaimed caliph in the Kufa Mosque, which was the beginning of the Abbasid Empire. The Abbasids moved their capital from Damascus, first to Kufa, and then to a new city that they built beginning in 762 near the old Sasanian capital of Ctesiphon, located in southern Mesopotamia at a point where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers flow very close to each other. Baghdad became a much more Persian-influenced and cosmopolitan city, with a population ultimately of about 1 million that was larger than any other city in the world, except probably Chang'an in China. Non-Arabs dominated the administration of an empire that would last 500 years, from this circular city of peace that became a center of culture and learning. The Abbasids entered their golden age in the late 700s under Harun al-Rashid, who established diplomatic relations with Charlemagne in Europe, who we'll talk about soon. Two of Harun's sons fought a civil war with each other for the throne. The victor, Abu al-Mamun, established the House of Wisdom, where Muhammad al-Khwarizmi published a book on a new form of mathematics that's now known as algebra. The House of Wisdom was probably built on the library of Harun, and it became a center for not only creating new works of scholarship, but preserving the knowledge of the classical world. Hunayn ibn Isaac translated works of Greek philosophy and science by Galen and Plato and Aristotle into Arabic. The philosopher, scientist, cryptographer, and musician Al-Kindi was a figure similar to what Aristotle had been in the ancient world, writing at least 260 books about geometry, medicine, philosophy, logic, and physics. Baghdad became a center for not only imperial administration and scholarship, but for the Silk Road trade, as had been the case with the Silk Road contact between the Han and Roman empires. This was not a direct trading relationship between the Abbasids and the Chinese, although the Abbasids did acquire paper-making technology that led to a huge expansion of literacy in a battle against Tang forces at Talas in Kyrgyzstan in 751. Instead, overland trade in items like silk, porcelain, glass, wool, and horses flowed between Baghdad and Chang'an via Merv in Turkmenistan, Samarkand in Uzbekistan, Kashgar on the way western limits of China, and then Dunhuang, which was kind of the gateway to China. By sea, goods including spices and ceramics and ivory and silk flowed through Basra in Iraq to Siraf in Iran, Daibul in Pakistan, Gujarat in India, Malacca in Malaysia, to the great port of Guangzhou in China. The goods were carried between these markets by middlemen from the surrounding regions, who spoke Persian, Chinese, and Turkic languages, as well as a caravan bazaar pidgin language of several hundred words that allowed traders to understand each other a bit, enough to get the deals done. Universal tools like math, using Indian-derived Arabic numerals, and using standardized weights established in Baghdad, also facilitated trade. The money used along the Silk Road included Abbasid gold dinars, Tang silver ingots, and Samanid silver drachms from Bukhara. Copper coins were not used in long-distance trade because they were just too heavy. Paper notes, called sak, what we would call checks, were also used, beginning actually in Harun's era. And suftaja, or letters of credit, were used by medieval Jewish merchants called Radhanites and by Sogdian, that is Uzbek, caravan drivers. Because many of these merchants operated in family or clan-based businesses, informal transfers based on trust, called hawala, were also widely used. These paper, credit, or trust-based payment systems had two really important advantages. First, gold and silver were incredibly heavy, and carrying them reduced the volume of goods that a merchant could transport. Second, gold and silver were easily stolen during long journeys through dangerous lands. Throughout history, cash has typically been the last resort, used only by people who are either total strangers or who know they will never do business with each other again. It's perfect for anonymous, one-off transactions, but it's unnecessary where ongoing networks can be formed. While all these developments were underway in the Islamic world, Europe was entering what we tend to think of as the Middle Ages, or the medieval period. After the victories of Charles Martel and the Franks that halted the Muslims' advance into Europe, Martel's son, Pepin the Short, became king of the Franks in 751, as I already described. His sons, Charles and Carloman, were both anointed to kingly status, along with their father Pepin, by Pope Stephen II during a papal visit in 754. This was the first time that a pope had ever crossed the Alps to visit what's now France. And it marks an early example of the church becoming involved in European politics. Stephen effectively deposed the last Merovingian king, Childeric III, and endorsed Pepin and his heirs as a new dynasty. In return, Pepin promised to protect the Vatican from the Lombards, who had attacked Rome in 753. And he did make good on that promise. But this act by Stephen established the idea of divine right of kingship in Europe, and established the Vatican as the power that could bestow that divine right. In 768, Charles and Carloman each inherited half of the Frankish kingdom when their father died. But Carloman then died 3 years later, leaving Charles as the sole king. Although he didn't claim this name during his lifetime, he is later known, of course, as Charlemagne, or Carolus Magnus, Charles the Great. So we'll begin using that name for him. In 774, Charlemagne defeated the Lombards in Italy and was crowned king of the Lombard kingdom, or effectively of all of Italy. Now, forcing the people that he had conquered to become Christians is remembered as kind of a key element of his campaigns and his kingship. In 782, during about a 2 decades long war in what's now Germany, called the Saxon Wars, Charlemagne ordered the execution of 4,500 Saxons, who were both rebels and pagans. In some accounts, he killed them because they were rebels. In others, he killed them because they refused baptism. In 788, Charlemagne annexed Bavaria. And in the early 790s, he extended his rule into territory along the Danube River near Vienna, what's now Austria, that had been held by the Avar Khaganate, a northeastern Asian empire that at its height extended from north of the Black Sea all the way to the Danube. They existed between about the middle of the 6th century and the early 800s. In 791, Charlemagne passed through Linz on the Danube and commissioned the building of St. Martin's Church. I visited Linz and stopped by St. Martin's Church, which is one of the oldest surviving churches in Europe, in the summer of 2025. Charlemagne also created a buffer with Muslim Iberia by capturing territory including Pamplona and Barcelona in the north of what's now Spain. By 800, Charlemagne controlled Europe from the Atlantic Ocean to the Elbe River, and from the Pyrenees to the Danube. On Christmas Day, 800, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne Emperor of the Romans, creating what would become known as the Holy Roman Empire. This revival of the title of emperor in what had been the Western Roman Empire angered the Eastern Romans, the Byzantines, who sent Charlemagne an ultimatum: return to your barbarian kingdom. The Roman Empire is one and indivisible, they said. After 802, every male over 12 years of age in Europe was expected to swear an oath of fidelity to Charlemagne as emperor, rather than to their local lord. Charlemagne's third son, also named Pepin, was put in charge of Italy and fought many small battles or skirmishes against Byzantine outposts or allies such as Venice. In the 812 Treaty of Aachen is in what's now Germany, the Byzantine Empire recognized Charlemagne as emperor, but left out the of Rome part. And the Franks gave back Venice and coastal Dalmatia. So the East got to keep face, but the Franks got most of the land. After Charlemagne's death, which was also at Aachen in 814, his dynasty lasted only until the death of his great-grandson, known as Charles the Fat, in 888. Culturally, though, the Carolingian impact on Europe was widespread and long-lasting. The Oath of Fidelity established a feudal system, which we'll talk about more in the next chapter, in which local lords were not really the ultimate authorities politically, although oftentimes they still were practically. Charlemagne also helped to establish a single Latin church that stretched from Ireland to Croatia, and to standardize education around a network of monasteries where scholars learned Latin, which was required of all priests and monks, and a course of study known as the Trivium and the Quadrivium were instituted. The Trivium consisted of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and the Quadrivium included arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. So a good course of study. The monks and scholars at these monasteries used a new writing system called Carolingian minuscule that, unlike the earlier script that had been used by people like the Merovingians, began using lowercase letters, inserted spaces between the words, and introduced punctuation. This allowed them to transcribe 3 or 4 pages per day, rather than just one. And as a result, over 1,000 volumes survive using this new technique, versus just about 50 from the previous Merovingian system. 90% of all Latin literature survives in Carolingian copies. So, along with those Muslim scholars in places like Baghdad, medieval monks also preserved classical texts like Plato and Virgil and Cicero. The 10% tax or tithe that everybody paid to the church funded schools, libraries, and scriptoria, where texts were copied. In day-to-day life, Carolingian customs and written law was taken up throughout Western Europe. Standardized weights and measures made trade easier or possible, and Carolingian money became the standard throughout Europe in the Middle Ages. That was carried on by most later nations. A pound, or libra, or livre, or lira, and consisted of 12 shillings, or solidas, or sous, which themselves were each worth 20 pennies, denarius, or denier. Although typically only the pennies were minted in large numbers and other denominations were really accounting units, this ratio continued in the French livre, the British pound sterling, until 1971 at least, the Italian lira, and the Spanish libra. Even centuries later, when there were few or no coins in circulation, these denominations were still used to value contracts and taxes and rents and banknotes in account books. And these denominations continued even after silver flooded into Europe from new German mines that were discovered in the middle of the 13th century. Now, the foes of Charles the Fat, the last Carolingian king, and his uncle and predecessor Charles the Bald, and the people that helped to end the Carolingian dynasty were the Vikings, a seafaring people originally from Scandinavia. They spoke Old Norse, and in addition to sailing and fishing, they lived by farming and by trade. But in addition to trading with the people that they met on their sea journeys, the Norsemen also raided and pillaged, and frequently worked as mercenaries. After watching Charlemagne subdue the Saxons, the Danish Vikings fortified their borders, and in the year 808, they conquered a Slavic tribe that was allied with the Carolingians to gain pretty much full control of the Baltic Sea. Norse raiding parties also began striking the British Isles in the late 700s. The first recorded attack was a raid on the island monastery of Lindisfarne in Northumbria in 793. And this shocked the Christian world. In 795, the Iona monastery in Scotland was sacked and looted. And in 799, Frisia in the Netherlands and Aquitaine in France were raided. In the 830s, the trade hub of Dorestad in the Rhine River Delta was sacked 4 times in 5 years, which seriously injured Carolingian commerce. In 845, the Vikings reached the Seine River and attacked Paris. Charles the Bald paid them 7,000 pounds of silver to prevent a sack of Paris. By the 850s, the Vikings had begun not only raiding the lands that they reached, but planting settlers there. In 851, rather than returning home for the winter, the Vikings wintered in England. By 865, they had taken over 4 English kingdoms. Only Wessex survived under Alfred the Great. In 866, Northumbria was conquered and became York, Jorvik in Old Norse. In 876, the Vikings also settled permanently in Frisia, and in 879, they wintered on the Seine. Charles the Fat paid them a 2,000 pound silver ransom in 882, but the Vikings returned with 700 ships and besieged Paris in 885. Charles the Fat once again paid a ransom of 700 pounds and didn't fight, which further diminished his reputation. Odo, the Count of Paris, gained prominence during this fiasco and ultimately became King of West Francia. and the progenitor of the House of Capet, which ruled France until 1328. The Vikings didn't limit their interest to England and Western Europe, however. From their traditional lands in the northern Baltic, they had also taken their longships, which had very shallow drafts and so could easily be rowed up into rivers, through the Gulf of Finland and into the river system that included the Neva, the Ladoga, and the Volkhov. By the mid-700s, they had established a trading settlement at Staraya Ladoga. These Vikings were known as Varangians, or simply as Rus, which means rowers. By 862, a legendary chieftain named Rurik was, according to the legend, invited by the local Slavs to rule over them. He moved from Ladoga to a new town, Novgorod, which literally means new town, on the Volkhov River, and founded a dynasty that would rule Russia until 1598. When he died in the 870s, Rurik passed leadership to his kinsman Oleg, who became a regent for Rurik's infant son, Igor. Oleg moved his capital to the much older nearby city Kiev in Ukraine, after apparently murdering its rulers, who may also at that time have been Varangians. The city then became a hub on a trade route that connected the Vikings with the Greek world. Oleg made treaties with Byzantium in 907 and 911, but his successor, Rurik's son Igor, attacked Constantinople twice in the 940s. In 941, a large part of his fleet was destroyed by Greek fire, which is an incendiary weapon for which we no longer know the formula or the recipe. And in 944, he made peace with the Byzantine emperor and began plundering Arabs on the Caspian Sea, probably at Byzantine urging. In 945, while he was trying to exact tribute on the Slavic Dravillian tribe, Igor was captured, and his legs were tied to two strong birch trees that had been bent down to the ground, and then the trees were released, and Igor was torn apart. His widow, Olga, took revenge on the Dravillians, killed the leaders, burned their city, and collected the tribute. She ruled as a regent for her young son, and she converted to Christianity when she visited Constantinople in the 950s. The Vikings also sailed their longships into the unknown North Atlantic, and in 874, a settlement party reached Iceland, led by Ingólfur Arnarsson, who is traditionally considered the founder of Reykjavik. There had long been stories of a large island in the North Atlantic, dating back to at least 330 BCE, when a Greek explorer named Pytheas had described his travels. After Ingólfur and his family settled, large numbers of Norwegians began to arrive, moving from their homes to escape their heavy-handed king, Harald. Within about 60 years, nearly all the arable land on Iceland was settled. For a few generations, the Viking settlers held on to their old traditions and their Norse gods. And incidentally, the Icelandic language is almost identical to Old Norse. So today's Icelanders can read the old sagas. But in 999, King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway threatened to cut Iceland out of the Viking trade routes if they didn't comply. So the Icelanders threw their idols over the Godafoss, the waterfall of the gods, and converted to Christianity. Just as Christianity was being forced on them, however, some Icelanders sailed even farther west. Erik Thorvaldsson was born in Norway, but moved with his family when his father was banished to Iceland, probably over a blood feud. Erik, who became known as Erik the Red, married an Icelandic woman and had 4 children. Around 982, Erik was himself banished from Iceland for 3 years, also over a killing. and he used this time to explore and to begin to settle Greenland. He established a settlement there that lasted until the early 1400s, and he lived there and led it until his death in 1003. Eric's son, named Leif Erikson, sailed even farther west, and after exploring along the coast of a new land, he established a small settlement that he called Vinland, on the northern tip of Newfoundland, which is Canada. Elsewhere in the Americas, at about the same time, the Mayan culture of the Yucatan, which is now Mexico and Guatemala, began abandoning large cities such as Tikal, Calakmul, and Copan, and moving north to new centers like Chichen Itza. This migration was probably due partly to changes in climate and partly to man-made problems. Tikal's population of over 100,000 people was very densely packed, with over 1,000 people per square kilometer. Lake core sediments show that for a period of over 50 years, rainfall dropped by nearly 50%. And pollen records show that the jungle had been about 90% cleared and removed, so that when the rain did fall, it wasn't stored in forest soils, but ran off or evaporated. The maize crop failure was also devastating, since corn was the staple crop that accounted for up to 3/4 of people's diets. Elite residences and temples were destroyed in this period and burned, suggesting some extreme social unrest. Between 850 and 900, population in the southern Mayan regions dropped by 90%. The people didn't die, though. They moved. Some moved north. Others just seem to have moved away from cities and the ceremonial culture that they had been living in for centuries. The Maya didn't die out at all. There are still well over 6 million Maya living in the same region today. They just seem to have changed their way of life and to have become much less urban and much less centralized. North American natives, however, who are not really thought of as having been quite as urban as their southern cousins, were at this time beginning to experiment with larger and more hierarchical communities. The mound-building cultures of the Ohio and the Mississippi River valleys took advantage of this warmer climate period to raise 2 or 3 crops of high-yielding flint corn in each growing season. And this created surpluses that allowed both monument building and some social stratification. By about the year 1000, cities like what we call Cahokia, we don't know what native people called it, were beginning to emerge, where powerful leaders lived on the tops of man-made mounds, looking down on acres of farms and farmers around them that they seem to have controlled. At its peak, Cahokia seems to have been a religious and political capital of a region that was connected to a continent-wide trade network. Cahokia's population of about 40,000 was at the center of a Mississippian culture zone that included probably a couple of million people and stretched from the Great Lakes to the Gulf. And finally, in Asia, China's Tang Dynasty was trying to recover from the An Lushan Rebellion, which was a civil war from 755 to 763, which was so chaotic that the Tibetan Empire, supported by Uyghur mercenaries, took advantage of the chaos to briefly capture Chang'an, the capital. Up to 36 million people died in this war, or 2/3 of the population that had been recorded in the Chinese census of 755. By the late 9th century, this number would rebound to about 80 million, but the empire was not able to return to the heights of culture and invention that had marked the first half of the Tang era. By the 850s, the government's salt monopoly made up about 90% of government revenue, and a 1% elite of Chinese people owned 70% of the land. In 878, a salt trader named Huang Chao declared himself emperor and conquered the commercial city Guangzhou, which was the endpoint of the Silk Road over water, as you'll recall, and about 120,000 merchants mostly Arabs and Persians, were massacred. In 881, his troops captured and burned the capital, Chang'an, and the actual Tang emperor fled. The city's population fell from well over 1 million to about 100,000. Irrigation canals were destroyed, and the course of the Yellow River was shifted. This is really a loss of the mandate of heaven. The dynasty limped on until 907, and it was followed by a chaotic period during which it's once again kind of difficult to see imperial continuity for a couple of generations until a new dynasty, the Song, took power in the year 960. And we will, of course, talk more about that in the next chapter. But that's all for now. So I hope you found this a little bit interesting. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you again very soon.